time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and appreciate this hearing because voter maintenance is extremely important. And before I begin my questions, I want to reiterate that this is a top priority for every Republican on the committee, that every lawful vote be counted and that every qualified voter is able to vote safely. That is extremely important. It's the basis of our nation and our election system. The integrity of our elections should be paramount as we exercise our role on this committee to oversee the federal elections process, and that includes ensuring that voter rolls are kept up to date. One issue that is a particular concern to me and many of my colleagues, and one that I will continue to be vocal about addressing, is the propensity for poorly maintained voter rolls to undermine public confidence in election results, especially with the increased prevalence of mass mailing ballots like we saw in the 2020 election. In fact, a member of my staff received 3 primary ballots during the last election cycle. The ballots did not belong to my staff member or anyone else who lived at that address, and they had lived at that address for several years. And at the residence for the elections in the jurisdiction which he received the ballots, they did not live. Basically, he lived in D.C., and these ballots came from Maryland to someone else's name. And again, he had lived at that address from way beyond the previous election. To be clear, these were not ballot applications, but live ballots. And in this scenario, if this scenario that had played out, now he took pictures of these ballots and he showed them to me, and he properly destroyed those ballots. But if this scenario plays out in states across the country, the potential for millions of ballots to be sent out indiscriminately without people requesting them and to the wrong address creates potential for fraud. I mean, he very well easily could have filled out these 3 ballots that weren't his. I mean, he's from Georgia, lives in D.C., received a Georgia ballot he requested, but received 3 ballots from Maryland he did not request, 2 other people's names. And this really brings doubt to the integrity of the election systems. Now, my questions, Ms. Phillips, your foundation brought enforcement action against states for failing to conduct comprehensive list maintenance as required under the National Voter Registration Act, as the ranking member has brought up. In your opinion, why are certain states reluctant to routinely conduct voter list maintenance?
In my opinion, the pressure has come from various interest groups not to maintain the rolls for myriad reasons. So the pressure is to do nothing. It's also at times difficult to conduct list maintenance. It requires diligence, it requires consistency, and there may be lack of training, various reasons why election officials would not conduct list maintenance.
Okay. I mean, one thing you didn't mention was funding. Have you ever encountered that maybe it's a lack of funding to do this?
Absolutely. And the problem is that having unclean rolls only makes the financial burden greater when you're mailing out pieces of mail to individuals that should not be registered to vote. So it's one of those tasks that should be a priority in order to trim budget in other places.
So you mentioned that there's pressure from outside groups, which we are fully aware of in Georgia. There's a lot of groups putting a lot of pressure on the election system on both sides. But you mentioned that they are putting a lot of pressure on some elected officials or government officials to not purge voter rolls. I know that in some cases there's threats of lawsuits, et cetera, et cetera. What impact does a state's failure to conduct their list maintenance have on the integrity of our election process?
As you mentioned, it is devastating to voter confidence. The example of one person receiving multiple ballots, especially for individuals that do not live in that location, those effects can be felt far and wide. So it is a voter confidence issue, and it also is just a misallocation of resources for these election officials that have, in many cases, very limited budgets anyway.
Well, thank you. And one last question for you. Are states required to coordinate with state or federal agencies to verify voter information when conducting their list maintenance?
No.
Okay. Turning to Ms. Laskin, you state in your testimony that accurate rolls are appropriate and necessary for election administration, and I'm glad to hear that the ACLU supports voter list maintenance. In your testimony, you highlight perceived problems with various databases available, but don't mention alternatives. If states need accurate voter registration lists, what databases or alternative measures should they use to maintain their lists?
Thank you, Representative. I think I mentioned earlier today that automatic voter registration, for example, is one solution, one assisted program that could provide assistance with maintaining accurate voter rolls, as well as ensuring that voters aren't improperly purged from the rolls. In addition, having good notice and sufficient time to voters who may have been purged from the rolls inaccurately to correct the record is absolutely critical in this regard, and is not always provided in the way that it should be provided, as is the case in Indiana, where we have sued successfully multiple times.
Well, and you know, making sure that only legal voters are the ones casting the vote is important. I could go through multiple stories of, even in this last election, people that have moved as much as a decade before started receiving ballots again from the state they moved from. And I've got numerous reports of that. And even people that are family members who called me and said, "Hey, I just want to let you know, I moved from state X 10 years ago. I just started getting a ballot again in this election," which was ironic that it was this election that they got the ballots that they had never, that they hadn't received since they left, which tells me it was a voter list issue. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. I appreciate the time, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. This time I will recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Butterfield.